The morning of Rose Day always feels quieter than people expect. There's a pause in the air on days like this, like the world hasn't decided whether it's going to lean into romance or pretend it's just another weekday. I woke up before my alarm, not because I had somewhere urgent to be, but because my mind was already ahead of the day. That usually happens when I care more than I admit. For a moment, I stayed still, watching the soft gray light press against the curtains. Somewhere in that half-awake space, I pictured a rose without trying to. Deep red, slightly imperfect, the kind that smells faintly sweet when you lean in, the way they did the first year we celebrated this day together. I hadn't seen one yet, but the expectation of it was already there. Quiet, patient, almost careful. I got out of bed quietly so I wouldn't wake him. The floor was cold under my feet as I walked toward the kitchen, pulling my robe closer around me. The coffee machine clicked on, filling the room with that familiar sound that makes a house feel occupied, even when it's mostly silent. I checked my phone while it brewed. No messages yet. That was fine, it was early. Rose Day wasn't about surprises anymore. At least, that's what I told myself. It was about intention. About the smallest acknowledgement that said, I still choose you. One flower, one pause in the rush of everything else. I had already chosen what I'd wear the night before. Nothing dramatic, just a soft cream sweater and jeans that felt like me. Comfortable, clean, intentional. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, smoothing my hair, checking my face, noticing how familiar hope can still feel even after years of marriage. I smiled, a little self-conscious, like I'd caught myself wanting something out loud. On the kitchen counter sat a small red envelope. Inside was a card I'd written after dinner the night before. I'd rewritten it twice, not because the words were complicated, but because I didn't want them to sound heavy. Love, at this stage of life, doesn't need poetry, it needs presence. I slid the card into my bag carefully, as if it could crease if I wasn't gentle. He came into the kitchen a few minutes later, already dressed for work. We exchanged the usual morning rhythm, coffee poured, keys checked, weather mentioned. He kissed my cheek before leaving, quick and familiar, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine, not in the way they usually did. I noticed it, then immediately told myself not to give it weight. Mornings are rushed, habits blur. Still, when the door closed behind him, the house felt quieter than it should have. By mid-morning, I stepped into a small florist near my office. The bell over the door chimed softly. It wasn't crowded yet, just a few people standing with the same careful urgency, pretending they weren't hoping too much. I chose a single rose, deep red, with petals that felt cool and firm under my fingers. When I lifted it, the scent was faint but real, not overwhelming, just enough to notice. The woman at the counter smiled as she wrapped it in simple brown paper. "Rose Day?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. I placed the rose on my desk when I got to work, angled so I could see it without trying. Every time my eyes landed on it, something inside me softened. I moved through emails, meetings, small conversations, all of it wrapped around the quiet awareness of waiting. Every vibration from my phone lifted my attention instinctively, then settled again when it wasn't him. I told myself that love doesn't operate on clocks. That belief had carried me through years of shared life, long days, missed dinners, postponed conversations. Still, sometime after lunch, I caught myself thinking something I hadn't expected. I couldn't remember the last time I'd waited this carefully for someone who already belonged to me. The thought didn't hurt, not sharply, it just existed, steady and honest, like a line drawn quietly across my awareness. In the afternoon, I sent a simple message. "Hope your day's going well." No heart emojis, no reminder, no weight attached. I left work on time, stopping briefly at the grocery store to pick up his favorite soup. The sky outside was already softening, that early winter dusk that makes everything feel slower than it is. Doing something ordinary helped. It grounded me. It reminded me that this wasn't about a single day, it was about us. At home, I put the soup away, straightened the living room cushions, and placed the card on the table where he'd see it easily. I didn't light candles, I didn't set a scene, I wasn't trying to stage a moment, I just wanted space for one to arrive naturally. I checked my phone again. Nothing. I showered, letting the warm water quiet the edges of my thoughts. I rehearsed nothing dramatic, just imagined an easy exchange, a smile, the rose handed over with a soft joke about how I still cared about these things. When I stepped back into the living room, wrapped in a towel, the house was still exactly as I'd left it. The rose I'd bought sat on the counter, still wrapped, waiting. The card lay flat, untouched. Everything was ready. I glanced at the clock. It was late enough for expectation to feel heavier than hope, but I wasn't there yet, not fully. I reminded myself that the day wasn't over, that love doesn't always arrive on schedule. I picked up my phone once more, my thumb hovering, then stopping. I waited.
Rose Day didn't end the way I had imagined it would, but it didn't collapse either. It simply thinned out, like air slowly leaving a room without making a sound. By the time evening settled in, the rose on my desk no longer felt like a promise. It felt like evidence of how much space can exist between intention and reality. I carried it home carefully, as if rough handling might somehow explain what hadn't happened. The house was quiet when I walked in. Not unusually so, just the kind of quiet you only notice when you're expecting something to interrupt it. I placed the rose in a glass of water on the kitchen counter. I straightened the card beside it, even though no one else was there to see it. I told myself not to read into silence. Silence, after all, has always been part of adult love. I reheated leftovers, I folded laundry that didn't need folding, I checked my phone once, then made myself stop. I didn't want to be the kind of woman who counted minutes when she already shared a life with someone. When his message finally came, it was short. Running late, crazy day, talk soon. It wasn't unusual, that's what made it difficult to question. He'd sent messages like that before, efficient, neutral, tidy. But as I stared at the screen, something small shifted in me. He usually sent voice notes when he was late. This time, there was only text. I noticed how my shoulders tightened before my mind could form a thought, like my body recognized something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I set the phone down and went back to the sink, letting the water run longer than necessary. I didn't ask follow-up questions. I didn't reply with disappointment wrapped in politeness. I answered the way I always did, understanding, flexible, reasonable. Take your time. Those words felt heavier than they should have. As the evening moved on, I realized I was listening more than waiting, listening for the sound of keys, for footsteps, for the ordinary signals that confirm a shared life is still aligned. They never came. At some point, I noticed the rose petals beginning to open, slowly, quietly, doing exactly what they were supposed to do, regardless of whether anyone was watching. I wondered when I had stopped expecting the same consistency from people. The next morning, Rose Day was already over. The world had moved on. Social media was flooded with photos, bouquets, captions, smiling couples framed in soft lighting. I scrolled past them without judgment. Everyone curates their happiness differently. What caught my attention wasn't a photo. It was a calendar notification. A shared work event. Rescheduled. Moved to the evening before. I stared at it longer than necessary, rereading the date. It explained nothing. And yet, it shifted something inside me. I didn't confront him about it, not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't ready to turn uncertainty into accusation. I needed to understand whether this feeling had weight, or if it was just the residue of unmet expectations. At work, I moved through my day the same way I always did. Meetings, emails, polite conversations that required the right expressions at the right time. No one could have guessed that anything had changed. But internally, I noticed how my emotional language began to simplify. I stopped asking myself why and started noticing when. When replies came later than usual, when explanations sounded rehearsed instead of natural, when eye contact lingered a second too short. None of it was dramatic, none of it was definitive, and that's what made it painful. There's a particular kind of heartbreak that doesn't arrive with evidence. It arrives with patterns, with small inconsistencies that refuse to organize themselves into a single accusation. I found myself remembering how he used to say he liked quiet days like that, how stillness meant safety to him. I wondered when that stopped being true, or if it ever had been. That night, I placed the rose back on the counter. Some petals had already begun to soften at the edges, not dying, just changing. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt alert. For the first time, I understood that what I was experiencing wasn't about love being taken away. It was about love no longer being enough to explain behavior, and that mattered. I went to bed without waiting for a message, not as punishment, not as strategy, simply because something in me needed rest more than reassurance. As I turned off the light, I realized something else, something quiet but unmistakable. This was no longer about Rose Day, and it was no longer about romance. It was about truth. And once truth enters a marriage, it doesn't announce itself. It observes, it records, it waits. Just like I did.
I didn't decide to look for answers. That's the part people misunderstand. There was no moment of resolve, no quiet vow, no internal speech where I told myself something was wrong. What happened instead was slower. Life continued, and I realized I was the only one still moving through it with full attention. After Rose Day, the world didn't react the way stories usually promise it will. No emotional shift, no delayed romance, no effort to compensate for what had been missed. Just ordinary days. And that's what made them dangerous. Mornings resumed their routine, coffee brewed, shoes by the door, but certain gestures didn't return. He stopped lingering in the doorway, stopped finishing sentences meant just for us. His presence remained, but its warmth didn't. I didn't ask about it. Not because I was afraid of answers, but because questions were no longer the most accurate tool. Observation was. It began with time. The way certain evenings stretched later than they used to, always accompanied by explanations that were reasonable, polished, and strangely interchangeable. Work, traffic, a last-minute obligation. Each excuse by itself made sense. Together, they formed a rhythm. I noticed how those nights aligned with days I was already distracted, days when my attention was split and my silence would be interpreted as understanding. That alignment didn't feel accidental, so I stopped adjusting myself around his schedule. I stayed consistent, and in that consistency, something shifted. He began anticipating discomfort before I expressed it, offering reassurance before confusion surfaced, apologizing without being asked. Because premature apologies don't come from awareness, they come from anticipation. That realization didn't hurt. It clarified. I became aware of how carefully conversations avoided detail now, how answers stayed broad, flexible enough to survive follow-up questions that never came. And I let them pass. Silence, when used correctly, becomes a mirror. One afternoon, while organizing old household paperwork, I came across a folder we hadn't opened in years. Insurance forms, property records, archived documents from a life we'd once managed together with transparency. I wasn't searching. That's important. My hands paused on a single page because something about its weight felt recent, too recent for where it was filed. The paper was thicker than most, official, slightly textured. The timestamp caught my eye first. A processing date. Local. Weekday. Mid-afternoon. I read it again, slower this time, because that was a day he told me he was out of town. I remember the physical sensation more than the thought itself. The stillness in my shoulders, the way my breath stayed shallow, not panicked, just suspended. I didn't sit down. I stood there, holding the document, letting the contradiction exist without explanation. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't proof of everything, but it was proof of enough. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because grief hadn't arrived yet. What came instead was recognition. This wasn't confusion anymore. This was alignment. Up until that moment, a part of me had still believed this was about effort, about miscommunication,
about love temporarily mishandled. But standing there with that document steady in my hands, something resolved itself quietly. This was no longer about love. It was about truth. Rose Day returned to me then, not as a memory of flowers, but as an idea. Expectation without vigilance, trust without verification, belief extended longer than reason allowed. The woman I was on Rose Day wasn't naive. She was loving, and love doesn't require punishment when it's misplaced. It requires boundaries. I began noticing details without urgency, how routines adjusted themselves around absences, how explanations followed patterns rather than events, how flexibility replaced consistency, always framed as consideration. I didn't react. That mattered, because reaction would have broken the rhythm before it revealed itself fully. Instead, I documented, quietly, not obsessively, deliberately. Dates aligned next to records, conversations beside timestamps, assumptions replaced with facts. This wasn't obsession, it was self-defense. Another record surfaced days later, smaller, almost forgettable on its own, but it matched the same window, the same explanation category, the same absence of logistical support. By then, the emotional question had already answered itself. What remained was structure. Truth doesn't rush. It waits for you to stop interrupting it with hope. By the end of that week, my internal noise had quieted completely. Not because I had all the answers, but because I knew which questions no longer mattered. I wasn't preparing to confront him. That distinction became clear to me. I was preparing to protect myself. And once that shift happens, there is no urgency, only precision. I returned the documents to their place, not hidden, not exposed, just ready. And that night, for the first time since Rose Day, I slept without waiting for something to arrive.
I didn't wake up one morning suddenly powerful. Power arrived quietly, the same way clarity does, without announcements, without witnesses. The rose from Rose Day was still there, not fresh anymore, not thrown away either. It sat dried and intact inside a glass bowl on the hallway console, its petals darkened at the edges, its stem stiff. I kept it on purpose, not as nostalgia, as reference, a reminder of what hope looks like when it has finished teaching you. By then, I wasn't searching for explanations anymore. I was preparing for accuracy. I started with what I already had: dates, times, emails I had archives instead of deleting, receipts that had once felt irrelevant. This wasn't anger-driven. It felt closer to proofreading a document after realizing a typo wasn't accidental. Every evening, after the house settled into its usual quiet, I sat at the dining table with my laptop closed. I worked offline, paper first, digital later. There's something grounding about ink and margins when your emotions are learning how to stand upright again. I created folders, not dramatic ones, just labeled neutral, factual, travel, financial, communication, legal. The word legal didn't scare me. It steadied me. I wasn't planning an exit yet. I was learning the language of protection. A week later, I booked a consultation. I didn't tell anyone, not because I was hiding, because this part wasn't for discussion, it was for understanding. The office was downtown, glass-fronted, quiet, no intimidating decor, no heavy symbolism, just clean lines and muted colors, the kind of place where truth doesn't need to raise its voice. Her name was Laura Bennett. She didn't ask why I was there right away. She asked how long I'd been married, whether there were shared assets, if there were children, if there had been recent changes in behavior or finances. Her tone wasn't sympathetic. It was precise. I appreciated that more than comfort. I slid the folder across the table when she nodded. I didn't explain every page. I let the documents speak in their own order. She took her time. Silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was working. This isn't a confrontation issue, she said finally, looking up. It's a documentation issue, and you've already done most of the work. That sentence settled into me like architecture. She didn't tell me what to do next. She told me what not to do. Don't accuse. Don't reveal what you know. Don't change routines abruptly. Don't attempt closure before leverage exists. Silence, she added, isn't avoidance. When used correctly, it's control. I didn't smile. I didn't nod dramatically. I simply absorbed it. On the way home, traffic slowed near a florist. Through the windshield, I saw red roses stacked in buckets outside the shop. A Valentine's Week leftover sale sign leaned crookedly against the window. Once, that would have hurt. Now, it felt instructional. Back at home, nothing changed on the surface. I cooked dinner, asked about his day, listened without annotation. He spoke freely, comfortably, because nothing about me signaled resistance. That was the shift. Not coldness, not distance, accuracy. I stopped filling silences with reassurance, stopped preemptively forgiving, stopped explaining myself. The more I stepped back emotionally, the more information arrived naturally. Bank notifications, calendar overlaps, travel confirmations that didn't align with spoken plans. I didn't react. I recorded. At night, when I placed the rose bowl back in its spot, I noticed something subtle. I no longer associated it with him, or even with that day. It had become a marker, before knowledge, after illusion. The legal process didn't feel aggressive. It felt procedural. Laura followed up with summaries, clear next steps, no urgency, no fear language. Nothing here requires haste, she wrote in one email. It requires completeness. Completeness became my focus. I gathered copies, verified timelines, made sure every claim could stand without my voice attached to it. Because the goal wasn't to be believed, it was to be undeniable. One evening, as he spoke casually about an upcoming work trip, I looked at him and realized something surprising. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even disappointed anymore. I was prepared. Silence was no longer confusion. It was control. And control didn't need witnesses. When I went to bed that night, I didn't replay conversations. I didn't rehearse future ones either. My mind was calm in a way it hadn't been since before Rose Day. Everything was ready. Not exposed, not announced, just aligned. The document had changed everything, but not loudly. It changed me first. By the time everything reached its final form, there was no chaos left inside me. That surprised me the most. People imagine endings as storms, raised voices, slammed doors, dramatic speeches that finally say everything that was held back. Mine didn't look like that. It looked like a calendar notification, a neatly labeled folder, a signature placed carefully on a line that had been waiting for weeks. The day the process concluded, I woke up early without an alarm. Not because I was anxious, but because my body had finally stopped bracing itself. I made coffee the same way I always did, black, no sugar. I stood by the kitchen window and watched the street come alive. A jogger passing by, a school bus slowing at the corner, someone walking their dog with sleepy patience. Life hadn't paused for my heartbreak, and somehow that felt comforting. The paperwork had done what arguments never could. Dates aligned, records spoke, timelines confirmed what silence had already taught me. There was no moment where I needed to explain myself, no speech prepared in advance, no final confrontation rehearsed in my head. The truth didn't require performance. It only required order. When the confirmation came through, it wasn't dramatic. No raised eyebrows, no gasps, just a professional acknowledgement that everything I had presented was consistent, verifiable, and complete. I remember sitting there, hands folded, listening as if this were someone else's life being summarized. Detached, but not numb. Present, but not shaken. That's when I understood something important. I hadn't lost control when I stayed silent. I had been collecting it. There was no public fallout, no scene to watch unfold, no victory to display.
The resolution happened quietly, the way truth prefers to move when it's confident. Later that evening, I came home to an apartment that felt different, even though nothing had physically changed. The furniture was the same. The walls still held familiar shadows, but the air felt lighter, as if the space had stopped holding its breath. I took off my shoes and walked barefoot across the floor, noticing details I'd ignored for years. The small scratch near the doorway, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the steady, unremarkable sound of peace. I realized I was no longer waiting, not for an explanation, not for remorse, not for closure from someone else. Closure had arrived in the form of clarity. In the days that followed, people around me noticed the shift before I named it myself. They said I looked calmer, more grounded, not happier, just settled. And they were right. I wasn't walking around with relief or anger or triumph. I was walking with something steadier, self-respect. I began reclaiming things slowly, without ceremony. My schedule, my name on documents that mattered, my evenings. There was no rush to redefine myself, no urge to prove resilience. I let stability speak for itself. One afternoon, while organizing a drawer, I found it. The rose, dried now, its color muted, edges fragile, stem carefully wrapped the way I'd left it. For a moment, I just held it. Rose Day had once meant anticipation, soft expectations, the belief that love, when nurtured quietly, would always show up when it mattered. I didn't feel bitterness looking at it. I felt understanding. That version of me wasn't foolish. She wasn't blind. She was loving. And love, when it's real, doesn't disappear just because it wasn't returned properly. It evolves. I placed the rose back, not in a place of honor, but not hidden either. It belonged to my past, and I wasn't ashamed of that. That night, I opened the window slightly and let fresh air move through the room. The city lights flickered outside, steady and indifferent. I thought about how love days are marketed. Roses, cards, gestures meant to prove something in 24 hours. What Rose Day means to me now is simpler. It's the day I learned the difference between expectation and evidence, between patience and denial, between silence that confuses and silence that protects. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I chose myself without noise, and that choice didn't need an audience. The woman I am now doesn't wait for love to arrive wrapped in promises. She recognizes it by consistency, by truth, by peace. Rose Day was about love. Now it's about clarity. And that clarity gave me something far more durable than hope. It gave me freedom.